The study method nobody taught you if you're a student. What I'm about to tell you could save you hundreds of hours of studying. Because there's a good chance you've been taught the wrong way to learn. Every student has lived this moment. You read the same page 3 times. You highlight the important sentences. You underline the definitions. You close the textbook. And you feel ready. You think, I finally understand it. Then the exam begins. The questions look familiar. You've definitely seen them before. But something strange happens. The answers disappear. Your mind goes completely blank. How is that possible? You spent hours studying. You recognized every page. You felt confident. So where did all that information go? Most students think they have a bad memory. They don't. They've been taught a study method that makes them feel like they're learning, without actually learning. And that tiny difference changes everything. Imagine 2 students. Same classroom. Same teacher. Same textbook. Same exam. Even the same number of study hours. One student spends the evening reading the textbook again, highlighting important paragraphs, going over the same notes, again and again. The second student studies for exactly the same amount of time. But instead of reading, they keep closing the book. They force themselves to remember. It feels slower. It feels frustrating. Sometimes they can't remember anything at all. If you watched both students, you'd probably assume the first one was learning more. After all, they looked confident. The second student looked lost. But when researchers followed experiments like this, they discovered something almost impossible to believe. The student who struggled more remembered dramatically more. Not the next day. Weeks later. Long after the first student's memory had disappeared. That discovery changed how psychologists think about learning. Because it revealed something almost nobody tells students. Your brain doesn't learn best when information feels easy. It learns best when remembering feels difficult. And that's the opposite of how most of us study. For years, schools have accidentally trained us to chase a feeling. The feeling of familiarity. You read a page. It looks familiar. You read it again. It feels even more familiar. Soon, your brain whispers, I know this. But familiarity is one of the biggest illusions in education. Think about this. Have you ever watched the same movie twice? The second time, you recognize almost every scene. Every character feels familiar. You know what's about to happen. But could you stand up right now and recite every line from memory? Probably not. Recognition is not the same thing as remembering. Your textbook gives your brain the answers while you're studying. Your exam doesn't. That's why so many students walk into an exam feeling prepared and walk out wondering what happened. They weren't remembering. They were recognizing. Psychologists even have a name for this. The illusion of competence. It's one of the most dangerous traps in learning. Because it doesn't make you feel confused. It makes you feel confident. False confidence is far more dangerous than knowing you don't know something. At least confusion tells you where to improve. False confidence convinces you to stop studying too early. And here's the part that shocked me. The students getting the highest grades aren't necessarily studying longer. Many of them are studying differently. They're making their brains work harder. On purpose. That sounds completely backwards. Why would making studying feel harder produce better results? The answer lies in how memories are actually built. And once you understand that, you'll never study the same way again. The answer begins with one of the most important discoveries in learning science. And it started with a simple question. What if students spent less time reading and more time trying to remember? To find out, researchers Henry Roediger and Jeffrey Karpik designed an experiment. Two groups of students, the same reading material, the same amount of study time, but with one critical difference. The first group did what almost every student does. They read the material. Then they read it again and again. By the end of the session, they felt confident. The second group studied very differently. They read the material once. Then the books disappeared. No notes. No highlighting. No textbook. Nothing. Their only task was to remember. They wrote down everything they could recall. Some remembered a lot. Some remembered almost nothing. It felt frustrating, slow, uncomfortable. If you had walked into the room at that moment, you probably would have said, the first group is definitely going to score higher. Because confidence can be incredibly convincing. But confidence can also be incredibly misleading. A few minutes later, both groups took a test. The rereading group performed slightly better. Exactly what you'd expect. If the story had ended there, we would probably still be teaching students to reread textbooks today. But the researchers weren't interested in what students remembered after 5 minutes. They wanted to know what survived. So they brought the students back. Not the next morning. Not later that afternoon. A full week later. And suddenly, the results completely flipped. The students who had struggled to remember, remembered far more. The students who felt less prepared, performed better. The confident group forgot much of what they thought they knew. That single experiment challenged decades of assumptions about learning. Because it revealed something surprising. Memory isn't built by putting information into your brain. It's built by pulling information out. Every single time you force yourself to retrieve an idea, your brain asks an important question. Is this information worth keeping? If the answer is yes, the memory becomes stronger. Not because you read it again, because you used it. Think of memory like a hiking trail through a forest. The first time you walk the path, it's difficult. Branches get in the way. The ground is uneven. You constantly lose your direction. That's exactly how new learning feels. But every time you walk that same path again, it becomes a little clearer. The grass gets pushed down. The obstacles disappear. Eventually, the path becomes so familiar, you can walk it without thinking. Your brain works in a remarkably similar way. Every successful act of remembering strengthens the pathway. Not the reading, the remembering. That's why staring at your notes for another hour often feels productive, while producing surprisingly little learning. Your brain is looking at the answer the entire time. It never has to search for it. And searching is where the growth happens. I want you to try something right now, without looking anything up. Think about the last chapter you studied. Close your eyes for a moment. Now ask yourself, what are the 5 most important ideas? Can you explain them without opening your notes? If that felt difficult, good. That feeling isn't failure. It's learning. Most students panic the moment they can't remember something. They think, I guess I don't know this. Then they immediately open the textbook again. But that's exactly the moment they should stay with. Because the struggle is the signal. It's your brain reaching into storage, trying to find the information. And every successful retrieval makes that memory easier to find the next time. Learning is supposed to feel effortful. If studying always feels easy, there's a good chance you're practicing recognition instead of recall. And those two things produce completely different results on exam day. So here's your first challenge. The next time you finish a chapter, don't read it again. Close the book. Put your notes away. Take a blank sheet of paper and write down everything you can remember. Not because you're testing yourself, because you're building the memory. You don't learn by seeing the answer one more time. You learn by forcing your brain to find it. And here's the incredible part. We've only covered the first third of the science. Because even if you use active recall perfectly, your brain is still going to forget. Not because you did anything wrong. Because forgetting is normal. In fact, your brain is designed to forget. Imagine if you remembered every conversation, every advertisement, every number plate, every password, every face you've ever seen. Your brain would become overwhelmed. So instead, it constantly asks one question. Is this information important enough to keep? If the answer isn't clear, it quietly deletes it. More than 100 years ago, a German psychologist named Hermann Ebbinghaus wanted to understand exactly how memory disappears. So he did something extraordinary. He spent years memorizing thousands of meaningless syllables. Over and over and over again. It sounds painfully boring. But what he discovered changed learning forever. He found that forgetting doesn't happen slowly. It happens incredibly fast. Within the first day, a huge amount of new information begins to disappear. After that, the rate of forgetting slows down. Imagine filling a bucket with water, then discovering there's a tiny hole in the bottom. At first, water pours out rapidly. Later, the dripping becomes slower. Your memory works in a remarkably similar way. The first 24 hours are the most important. And that's exactly why cramming feels so deceptive. Think about the night before an exam. You've probably done it before. Coffee on the desk. Music in your headphones. The clock says midnight. Then 1 o'clock. Then 2. You're reading chapter after chapter, feeling like you're finally making progress. By the time you go to bed, everything feels fresh. The next morning, you even manage to answer a few questions. You walk out thinking, maybe cramming actually works. But here's what most students never see. Ask yourself those same questions. A week later, most of the information has already disappeared. Cramming is brilliant. If your goal is remembering something for a few hours. It's terrible if your goal is learning. Because your brain never had time to decide that information mattered. Memory isn't built in a single study session. It's built between study sessions. And one of the most powerful parts of that process happens while you're asleep. When you fall asleep, your brain doesn't simply switch off. It gets to work. Throughout the night, it starts replaying pieces of what you learned during the day. Almost like watching highlights from a football match. Some memories are strengthened. Others are discarded. The brain is deciding, what should I keep? What can I safely throw away? That's why studying for 1 hour across 5 different days is dramatically more powerful than studying for 5 hours on a single night. Every time you return to the material, you're sending your brain the same message. This wasn't an accident. I need this again. This is important. And your brain listens. This is called spaced repetition. It's one of the simplest ideas in learning science. And one of the most ignored. Most students wait until they're about to forget everything. Top students review information just before it disappears. Think about watering a plant. You don't pour 30 liters of water onto it once every month. You give it small amounts consistently. Your memory grows the same way. Small reviews. Repeated over time. Always beat one giant study marathon. So here's a simple system you can start using this week. Study a topic today. Tomorrow, don't reread it. Close your notes and see what you can remember. 2 or 3 days later, Repeat the process. Then review it again a week later. Each review becomes faster, easier, and surprisingly shorter. Because you're no longer rebuilding the memory. You're strengthening it. At this point, you already know more about learning than most students ever discover. But the highest performing students do one more thing. And at first, it makes absolutely no sense. They deliberately make studying feel more difficult. Why would anyone do that? Because the right kind of difficulty doesn't slow learning down. It makes learning last. And that's the final piece of the puzzle. Now we reach the final piece. And it's probably the most surprising one. The best students don't always make studying easier. Sometimes, they make it harder. On purpose. At first, that sounds ridiculous. If learning already feels difficult, why would you make it even harder? Because not all difficulty is bad. Some difficulty is exactly what your brain needs. Cognitive psychologist Robert Bjork calls these desirable difficulties. The name sounds strange. But the idea is simple. The harder your brain has to think, the stronger the learning becomes. Imagine you're learning basketball. Would you become a better player by taking the exact same shot 100 times in a row? Maybe. But what happens in a real game? The distance changes. The defender moves. The angle changes. Every shot is different. Studying works the same way. Most students spend 2 hours solving one type of problem. Then they move on to the next chapter. Their brain becomes comfortable. It starts recognizing patterns instead of making decisions. But exams don't ask, "Can you repeat what you just practiced?" They ask, "Can you recognize which method to use?" Those are completely different skills. Instead of solving 10 identical algebra problems, mix them together. One algebra problem, then geometry, then probability, then back to algebra. Now your brain has to stop and think. What kind of problem is this? What strategy should I use? That tiny moment of uncertainty is exactly where learning happens. It feels slower. It feels more frustrating. But it prepares you for the uncertainty of a real exam. By now, you've probably noticed something. Every technique we've discussed has one thing in common. None of them make studying feel easier. Active recall forces you to struggle. Spaced repetition forces you to return when you've already forgotten. Interleaving forces you to constantly switch between different ways of thinking. None of them feel comfortable. And that's precisely why they work. The biggest mistake students make is using comfort as a measure of learning. If it feels easy, I must be learning. But real learning really feels easy. Think back to the first time you learned to ride a bicycle. You wobbled. You lost balance. Maybe you even fell. It felt difficult. Then one day, without realizing it, you simply knew how to ride. You didn't become better because it was easy. You became better because your brain adapted to the challenge. Studying is no different. The moments that feel frustrating today are often the moments you'll remember on exam day. So let's put everything together. If you have an exam next week, don't start by rereading the textbook. Read a section once. Close the book. Write down everything you can remember. The next day, repeat the process. A few days later, come back again. Then mix different subjects or different problem types into the same study session. Don't judge your progress by how comfortable you feel. Judge it by how much you can explain without looking at your notes. Because that's exactly what your exam will ask you to do. And I want to leave you with one final challenge. Tonight, don't highlight another page. Don't reread another chapter. Don't convince yourself that recognition is enough. Take a blank sheet of paper. Close every book. Close every tab. And spend just 10 minutes writing down everything you can remember. When you get stuck, don't panic. That struggle isn't proof that you're failing. It's proof that your brain is learning. You don't build strong memories by seeing the answer again. You build them by searching for the answer yourself. That's the study method nobody taught you. Not because it's new, but because most schools still spend more time teaching subjects than teaching students how to learn those subjects. If this video changed the way you think about studying, subscribe to the Growth Blueprint. Every week, we break down the science, the psychology, and the practical skills that school never teaches, so you can learn faster, think better, and build a future you'll be proud of. Remember, your grades are not determined by how many hours you study. They're determined by what your brain does during those hours. Learn smarter. And I'll see you in the next blueprint.